Hi, Social 20, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Napoleon. Last lesson, we looked at how France had kind of left the conditions after the French Revolution. They had thrown over the monarch. They didn't really have a strong sense of leadership. And so we're going to look at this individual called Napoleon who came into power and the controversies around him, but also as well his accomplishments in France at the time. So let's get started. So, understanding a little bit about Napoleon, he is a very controversial figure. He is a very well-known figure. He has memes made about him, about his height, about a lot of the ways that he ruled. But Napoleon is actually one of the world's greatest military leaders, and he came into power mainly through a lot of his reputation in the military. And one of his goals in the military at the time was really to defeat the British. So he had a large sense of competition with the British. He wanted to lead France to greatness. And one of the ways that he wanted to do that was through a lot of military strength and battles. So he actually staged what's called a coup. He took over leadership and declared himself the emperor. There's a very famous picture here to the right. His wife is there, and basically he had taken the crown and placed it onto his own head, very symbolically took power, made himself into emperor. But at the time, why did people not resist? Because they had not had a strong leader who would really run the country. They were kind of worn down. They didn't have a system in place. So in a lot of ways, he took leadership, but people were also willing to give it to him, which is important to understand. Now, he had led a lot of successful military campaigns. He had been successful in battles, and he had a very strong sense of making people feel important, as well as knowing how to lead. So he led a lot of battles with, the French army underneath him, under the kind of guise of I want to make France great, but a lot of it were very personal battles to him. And so he had led a lot of successful campaigns, but he had also led a lot of disastrous campaigns. And he was ultimately, his great loss was through disastrous military campaigns. And so he had tried to take other areas around France and go into them and conquer them and make them French as well. And so he got the emboldened idea to do the same thing by marching his army all the way down to Russia. The idea was to conquer Moscow, but what he didn't really account for were a lot of things like the geography. And so the Russians knew as he came close, they would try to kind of lead him out into certain areas, and they knew winter was coming and they couldn't really live off the land. So unfortunately, a lot of soldiers did perish under his leadership, and ultimately he was not able to conquer Moscow and the Russians because they knew the territory, they knew the land, they knew it better than Napoleon, and he kind of underestimated that and overestimated his soldiers. And so there was a large loss of life, and that was seen as a real failed defeat, and a little bit of a loss in security as him as a leader. So one of his campaigns, of course, was very well known, was Moscow, and he was exiled to an island called Elba. He was exiled twice, actually. So the first time he was exiled, he came back. The people kind of accepted him. He was great at giving speeches, at rallying people around, convincing them that they should fight for France and all of the things that she stood for, and they were going to make France great. And they accepted him. And again, he went into a battle with the British called Waterloo. That was his final defeat. And it was, when people say that was my Waterloo, that is an expression that means I couldn't recover from that. That battle was too big. That for me was over. And he was exiled again, where he did die ultimately off in exile. So the factors, again, when we look at the historical, the social, political, economic, we can also attribute those to Napoleon. So after the French Revolution, when we look at historically where they were in an unstable period as a country. So he emerged as this leader that was going to put the country back together. And that was really quite a popular idea and really helped him get into power. He was seen as this hero of the revolution, somebody who was going to take them from what they had accomplished and take them even higher into a sense of prestige to other countries. He was going to fix a lot of their problems economically, and in a lot of ways he was. So he had kind of capitalized on the weakness in France, and he was going to work really hard to build France back up as a country. Economically, he made some great reforms. He redid the banking system and the monetary system. He became responsible for making the currency very strong. So people wanted to actually trade once again with France. He had a taxation system that was very fair. People saw France gaining stability, having a sense of equality among the people, and it attracted money into the country. As well, he provided a means for people to be able to start their own businesses, and that was a very popular and very successful reform. So he did economically make a lot of positive reforms. A lot of it was through stability. So making sure that they were taxing evenly and people were able to get ahead and put money back into their own pursuits and businesses. And he was very successful in that. Once again, however, he wanted to use a lot of the money that he had used to build up the country to also put it back into the military. His army was called the Grand Army, and a lot of people were in support of the building up of a military. Of course, they had had a different sense of military before, and he believed that soldiers should be recognized. It was not seen as it was in the French Revolution, when really the military was the low of the low and people had nowhere else to go. This was now seen as prestigious to fight for your country. Leading on from that, he believed in the idea of what's called meritocracy. So awarding people merit based on something that they have accomplished, not just who they were or how, what family they were born into. So he created what was called the Legion of Honor. It was a award for citizens for both military and non-military service. So the idea of service into your nation was so popular that it created this sense of nationalism. And in a lot of ways, Napoleon was seen as this kind of poster boy for nationalism. And it started with creating a sense of pride. So awarding medals. So you created a sense of wanting to see if people would serve their country. So it created loyalty. It created a sense of camaraderie amongst people. So awarding medals based on effort was very new to them because they had no chance of leaving an estate system for so many years. He also created what was called the Napoleonic Code. So this was a common set of laws. It was about education and legal equality, and some of actually the parts of the Napoleonic Code are still in use today. And that mainly relates to like education, some of the legal equality. So it was really about bringing up the people in society to a more even level. So access to education, equality were really large, necessary reforms for France at the time. As well, because of the power of the clergy, we looked at that first estate and how powerful they were, that nobody would dare to really question a lot of the relationship with the church. It was very sour around the time of the end of the revolution. And so because of how the power had been wielded before, people had a very kind of broken relationship with the Catholic Church after the revolution. And Napoleon, one of the things he did do was create what's called the Concordat, and it was basically an agreement of peace and a resolution to this broken relationship with the church. Before, religion was seen as a very obligatory practice by people in France. They didn't have the choice. They had to tithe, they had to give 10% of their income. And now, through reforms and time, Napoleon created the idea that people could have choice. How they express religion, it was not a forced obligation, and it really kind of healed and changed people's relationships with religion. So politically, we'd seen that they had attempts at leadership after the monarch, but the country was very much learning how to become a democracy, or how to use a constitution, if you would say. So because Napoleon had strength in his military, he used it to stage what's called a military coup, which is a takeover. And he really put what was ultimately what we would now consider a dictatorship. And so they kind of went from some form of a dictatorship under a monarch to another dictatorship under Napoleon, because he crowned himself, he put himself in power. So the irony is kind of they did go full circle, but ultimately he had brought different reforms with him. So he ruled them really ultimately as a military dictatorship, strong military campaigns, and that was a large part of his ascension into leadership. So politically, they did propose the idea of voting and equality among people, mainly men, but it still had that sense of a rule by one or a small group of people. Geographically, when we look at those factors, ultimately Napoleon, much like France, had a sense of geography. The cold, harsh winters followed by the drought, which led to a factor in the revolution. So did it lead to a factor with Napoleon. And his ultimate defeat was really through the Russian campaign, when he tried to draw them into Moscow to take over Russia. And it was really a failed part of his leadership that ultimately led to his downfall. And they used a scorched earth policy in Russia. When they knew that Napoleon and his troops were coming, they'd burn the grass and the ground. And then by the time they arrived, there was nothing to use. They couldn't actually access anything in the ground. They couldn't survive. So he ultimately was defeated a lot by geographic factors. What Napoleon is ultimately known for is really spreading the idea of nationalism. He created a sense of pride and loyalty in his people in France, and that didn't just stay in France. So when he tried to take over other areas surrounding France, they had a sense of wanting to come together to stop this. And ultimately, he also created nationalism in others through ultimately wanting to not become a part of France. And so a lot of these occupied territories that he would go into were not wanting to be ruled by him. And so inadvertently, he also created a rising up of nationalism in the countries that he was involved with. He had a brother, Joseph, who ruled Italy, and they had a growing sense of Italian nationalism as well. They felt very divided in parts of their country, and so he had a lot of positive outcomes in the spread of nationalism throughout Europe. He still remains controversial because he did have a lot of positives to his leadership. He ultimately was a person that instilled a sense of nationalism and pride and merit and access to education and more equality. And they were a very tumultuous country when he came into power. But ultimately, he still was someone who was out for himself. He led a lot of disastrous military campaigns that cost a large amount of lives. And he was seen as a little bit of a terror because he wasn't happy to keep his rule just to France. He wanted to grow it to the surrounding countries, and that did cause a lot of conflict with the areas surrounding him. I'll see you next time.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website, online.plrd.ab.ca, and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.